For those of you who are just joining, welcome again. This is the first session of a two-part series. We invite you to participate via the chat feature as well as the Q&A. There will be designated time at the end of this afternoon's webinar where we will answer your questions, so feel free to drop them into the Q&A box throughout the presentation. As you know, if you've been here before, I really see this as an opportunity for us to come together as a community of learners, community of practice. So I also invite and encourage you to drop your thoughts into the chat box, your aha moments, your stories, your anecdotes, anything that you want to share with others. This afternoon, we're going to focus on a few different things. So for those of you who've been to the past few webinars that we've done together, we've really focused on inclusion in schools, inclusive education, with really a focus on kind of the gen ed classroom and or special ed classroom. This workshop is really going to look at inclusion from more of a global perspective, inclusion from more of a societal lens. And I recognize that we have a combination of parents of students with disabilities, as well as administrators and educators and paraprofessionals on this webinar. So we've got a lot of people from different perspectives in this work. So what I'd like us to do this afternoon is really consider this idea of inclusion on a more global perspective, inclusion beyond the brick and mortar classroom and even beyond the brick and mortar school building. So we're going to talk a little bit about what might be a global definition of inclusion. Consider the places and spaces that your students and or children with disabilities engage with throughout your community. We're going to touch upon the idea of the role that disability representation in mainstream media plays in supporting inclusive society. And then we'll end with some moving forward strategies, techniques, things to consider. So to kick us off, I wanted to share, again, for those of you who've been here before, you know I like to show these little videos to spark inspiration. And so I want to start with a very short 2-minute video that is titled "Inclusion Makes the World More Vibrant." And I wanted to share this video because it's not a video that takes place in a school. We're looking at other community centers where inclusion is important. And as you watch this video, I really challenge you to think about why it was titled "Inclusion Makes the World More Vibrant." And I invite you to drop your thoughts into the chat as you watch. So again, why do you think this video was titled "Inclusion Makes the World More Vibrant," and how does it relate to our conversation this afternoon on inclusion beyond the school building?
Mom, my shoelaces.
You can do it.
Please.
Okay. 2 bunny ears, loop around and pull together. Got it?
I don't want to be here.
James, I want you to pick an artwork you like and tell me about it. Art is a wonderful thing and I want to enjoy it with you, okay?
Okay.
What do you see?
Sit here.
Okay.
Before you towers a terrifying scene of war. Thousands of horses who break the grassy ground in a cavalry charge. Soldiers sporting blood-red uniforms ride with valor in a fearless resolve to attack. Some blow military bugles, others raise their voice in a war cry. Mighty silver blades are exalted above their heads. Leading up front, a commander on a mighty white stallion. The beast's eyes were wide and ferocious, every muscle and vein pulsing through his skin. The commander rides the steed high, his face blazing with heroism, but still in his eyes a glimmer of fear. For at the front line, survival is not guaranteed.
I'm so proud of you.
Can you describe that one to us over there?
So again, I ask you to think about, why do you think this was titled Inclusion Makes the World More Vibrant? And or why you think I might have chosen this short video clip to really kickstart this afternoon's webinar around the value, the appreciation of inclusion beyond the school building. So let's start with what might be a global definition of inclusion. For those of you who've joined me in the past webinars, we've really focused on definitions around inclusive education, right? Definitions that are really focused around inclusion of students with disabilities in the traditional school setting. And so the focus this afternoon is really to get a little broader than that and think about, well, what might be our definitions for inclusion of individuals with disabilities in all of society, not just in the standard classroom environment. So a couple examples that I wanted to share with you. This one comes from the Center for Disease Control, and I believe the link to this resource is on the Padlet as well. Inclusion of people with disabilities into everyday activities involves practices and policies designed to identify and remove barriers such as physical, communication, and attitudinal that hamper individuals' ability to have full participation in society, the same as people without disabilities. So again, a pretty standard, universal, broad definition of inclusion of people with disabilities in society from the Center for Disease Control. Another definition I want to share is from the Center for Parent Information and Resources. Again, I believe this link is in the Padlet. And this definition reads, inclusion is being a part of what everyone else is, being welcomed and embraced as a member who belongs. It is being a part of what everyone else is and being welcomed and embraced as a member who belongs. So repeated twice for greater emphasis. So now what I'd like you to do is think about what would be your definition of inclusion. Again, for those of you who've been on previous workshops, we've really focused on the definition of inclusive education, right? Or authentic inclusion in the classroom. And for right now, I want you to think much broader. I want you to think about inclusion in society, right? Because the goal here in all this work is that our students with disabilities graduate high school and become participating members of society. So I'm going to give us about a minute or so of some quiet think time. You can tell that's the former elementary educator in me, the think time. And what I'd like you to do is drop your broad definition of inclusion in society into the chat so we can start to see what other members of this attendance are thinking. So here they come in. So I see belonging and acceptance in the world, authentic belonging and participation. Everyone matters. I love these kind of like, I think this is such an easier way to think about inclusion, right? In the previous ones, if you joined us, inclusive education, I think everyone's thinking about like they have to use big words that they learned in their schooling to become an educator or an administrator. And, this is just, let's include everyone, equal opportunity, very general. Acceptance and not just awareness. I love these. Keep them coming. And I invite you to scroll up and down. So now that we've taken some time to really think about what those definitions are and really broaden our lens from just kind of focusing on inclusive education or inclusive learning environments in the traditional school setting, what I want us to do is kind of consider what are the places and spaces that your students with disabilities or your children or child with disabilities may interact within your community. Because again, what we're thinking about is beyond the brick and mortar school, right? As students age out, whether that's senior year of high school or age 22, and they start becoming a part of the greater community, what are those places and spaces in your community that these young people are going to want to be included in? And I recognize that the places and spaces in each community are a little subjective because every community is unique and individualistic. As we think about the places and spaces, I feel like everyone is on this webinar because we're all change makers or visionaries in some way. One way that I like to think about bringing this kind of inclusive definition to life is to think about unpacking it in these three areas. So considering all of the places and spaces in your community, right? So if that's a school community, we might be thinking about classrooms, cafeteria, school buses, gymnasiums. If we're thinking broader about society, we might be thinking the bank, the grocery store, the dentist office, the hospital, right? The movie theater, the bowling alley, the places that we might frequently go. So when we think about all those spaces, we should really start to consider what would they look like if they were truly inclusive to individuals with disabilities. If you walked into that space, what would you see? What observations would you make? What would be happening? Where would the furniture be? What would it feel like, right? Like, what's that emotion, right? We all know the feeling of belonging, the feeling of acceptance, the feeling of being welcomed, right? So what do these places and spaces in our communities look like in an ideal world, fully included? What do they feel like? Or what do they sound like? What might you hear when you walk in? And so when we really consider kind of those definitions of inclusion, we can then take it one level deeper and go, okay, in the places and spaces that maybe I have control over, what could I do to tweak the environment to make it look like, feel like, and sound like a place that truly fulfills my definition of inclusion? Again, for those of you who are joining, feel free to drop thoughts in the chat and any questions you have in the Q&A. So as we think about the places and spaces that we want to look, feel, and sound more inclusive, I would really suggest in your role, whether you're a paraprofessional, an administrator, a parent, I would really suggest that you start writing a list of what are the places and spaces that your student or child with a disability interacts with or will interact with as they get older. So make one big list, and then I would suggest making another list of the places and spaces that you have some control over. right, in making inclusive change. So places like the school and all of the parts of the school, the courtyard, the playground, the hallways, thinking about modes of transportation. How is your child or student, as they graduate high school and move into young adult life, how are they going to get around? Are they going to drive their own car? Are they going to be taking public transportation? What are the ways that they're going to be moving around their community? And how can those places sound like, feel like, and look like inclusion? Recreational activities, playgrounds, parks, movie theaters, bowling alleys, you name it, all of shopping malls, all of those recreational places that they might be going to. Thinking about places of self-care, hospitals, dentist office, the hairdresser, all of the places that an individual might need to go to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Places related to daily tasks would be things like the grocery store, things like the post office, things like the bank, the places we go daily to just keep up with life. Travel. How can we ensure that our young people with disabilities have the opportunity to travel, move beyond their community, experience other communities, but ensure that they're able to do that in a fully inclusive way? And lastly, considering place of employment. How is the place of employment for a young person with a disability inclusive to their disability so they can achieve their greatest potential? So again, working with the employer to think about, okay, what do we need this place to look like, sound like, and feel like for a certain individual to perform to the highest level possible in their job position? So at first on the agenda, when I put places and spaces, you might have been thinking like, what does he mean by that? Hopefully now I've been able to unpack that a little bit more for you. And you're able to really start thinking about whether current students in the future, where your child interacts on a day-to-day basis now, and where they're going to interact in the future, and really start thinking about all those community places and spaces and how we can ensure that they are more inclusive, or that 10% change that we're always trying to achieve, 10% more inclusive to individuals with disabilities. Now, when we think about what it looks like, feels like, and sounds like in each of these places and spaces to be more inclusive, I think it's really important. And I recognize that this slide might kind of combat some misconceptions. People might be disagreeing with some of what I put on here, and it's totally fine. Put your thoughts in the chat. Happy to have a conversation about it. But I think it's really important that we unpack and segment two categories here. So there are things that are put in place as a result of Americans with Disabilities Act that are really put in place for access, that people with disabilities have access to all the same places and information and services as those without. Now, in my mind, access to information is very different than inclusion. So let's talk about this a little bit more. And I'd love your thoughts in the chat if you agree or disagree with this. So access to information would be things like closed captioning. Access would be things like when you go into the elevator, the buttons for each floor has a number as well as Braille. Access would be reserved parking spaces closer to the front of buildings or closer easy access to wheelchair ramps. Access into buildings with ramps rather than stairs, elevators, and access to service animals, right? So all of those things are not necessarily creating more inclusive learning environments. All of those things are just providing more equity and access to the same information and access into the physical places and spaces and ability to interact when you're in there, like to know what floor to click on the elevator. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, when we think about inclusion Inclusion is that sense of belonging, that kind of intangible feeling. Now, we might need to put pieces of access in place under Americans with Disabilities Act to get to inclusion. So one is not mutually exclusive of the other, but they are different. Inclusion is the ability to participate. So you might have a ramp into a building, but is everybody able to participate once they're inside? Now, that's a different question. Inclusion is engagement in the task. So I want to be really mindful that when we think about creating more authentically inclusive places and spaces in schools and in society, that there is a difference between putting things in place that just provide equal access and equitable opportunity in the place, then there is a sense of truly a sense of belonging and ability to participate, and that everyone feels like they have a role and a responsibility to play that I would argue is more inclusion. And I know that this might be challenging some people, but that's part of these webinars, right? Like we're trying to dig a little bit deeper on these topics. For those of you who've been with me before, you know that I like to include quotes throughout the webinar to really spark continued engagement and inspiration. For this afternoon, I've chosen quotes from individuals with disabilities. And this quote reads, "Abled does not mean enabled. Disabled does not mean less abled." So one piece of creating more inclusive societies, I think, is considering how our societies are influenced. And in 2022, where we all spend way too much time on our phones, myself included, totally guilty, whether that's Facebook, whether that's TikTok, whether that's Netflix, whether that's Instagram, whatever it might be. When we go to cities, we're just bombarded with visual stimulation on big billboards. There's a gazillion streaming services now to watch TV. That I would argue that representation of disability, authentic disability, in mainstream media is a driving force in pushing our societies to be more or less inclusive of people with disabilities. So I want to highlight some positives here, because there's been a big movement in really ensuring that disability representation is more prevalent in mainstream media. And as I share some of these examples, feel free to pop in the chat if you've seen any of these, your thoughts, or if there's others that I'm missing. So a few that I want to draw your attention to, and I hope that if you haven't watched these, you kind of add these to your little list, because I think these could be really powerful and influential in helping to bring light in a mainstream media way, disability. So these are all these are movies and TV shows up here. So CODA is brand new. CODA stands for Child of Deaf Adult. Marlee Matlin is in it, and it's the story of a family, and the father, mother, and brother are all deaf and communicate using American Sign Language. And the teenage high school daughter is the only one who is able to speak and use sign. And so she ends up kind of taking a very interesting role in this family dynamic of being their go-to translator. So really great one, CODA. It's a newly, I actually just watched it a couple weeks ago when I was on a plane traveling for work. Atypical is the story of a young man. It's a Netflix original TV series. The story of a young man who lives with autism and how he experiences the world. One of the things that I think they did a really nice job with in this is times in the show where the camera is sharing the point of view of the individual who lives with autism, and really just how he navigates teenage life being on the spectrum. Best Summer Ever is a movie that came out this summer. And what's really neat about this movie is actually all of the actors and all of the actresses have disabilities themselves, but they never draw attention to disability. So it's just, you actually don't even realize it till about halfway into the movie. So it's a great movie about teenagers with disabilities, even though they don't draw attention to it. It's just commonplace status quo that go to a summer camp and kind of all the regular things that would happen to teenagers at summer camp. Speechless was a TV show on ABC a couple years ago now. And one of the things that's really interesting about this TV show is that it features a family whose one of their sons has cerebral palsy and is, lack of better terms, pretty nonverbal, and uses a power wheelchair for his mobility. And it's really their journey raising this son, and they face a lot of examples of ableism and ableistic perspective that they have to overcome. But it's a great show, very kind of comedy based. I just want to pull up the chat here and see if there's anything else that I'm missing. It sounds like a lot of people have seen. So Peanut Butter Falcon, folks are recommending as a movie. Some other ones, seems like some of these folks are familiar with. Crip Camp is a great one, documentary on Netflix. Yep, thanks Cynthia for sharing that. Oh yeah, and Emily, yeah, the sibling perspective. Actually, in a lot of these movies, the sibling perspective is really, really unique, and something that I think, especially for the parents on the call this afternoon, the taking into consideration your kids without disabilities and how they might experience the world having a sibling that needs some extra accommodations, etc. Oh, Layla, As We See It. I haven't heard of this one yet. As We See It. Oh, Born This Way, reality TV show. I think that's about Down syndrome. Great. I love the sharing of resources in the chat. Keep them coming. So when we think about media, mainstream media as a way to inspire, educate, and promote more inclusive societies, I think, being aware of these and sharing these with others, hosting a virtual watch party with your friends or neighbors. If you're in schools, thinking about showing one of these films to students is just a really great way to continue to inspire this change that we're trying to achieve. So media is not just limited to TV shows and video movies, but media is also a part of books. There has been a growing trend recently as talk about inclusion and disability representation has really become on the forefront of people's minds, that there's been a lot of new books out there published recently. So books can be a great way to talk to friends, family, and our children and our students about disability. So a few that I might highlight, How Katie Got a Voice is a picture book about a young girl who gets an AAC device to communicate. The Thing About Georgie is a chapter book about a boy named Georgie who lives with dwarfism. Wonder is a pretty common one these days. There's also a movie of that about a young man who was born with a facial difference as well as a hearing loss. Coincidentally, the same facial difference that I was born with. I've had 8 facial reconstructive surgeries and wear a bone conductive hearing aid. The Alphabet War is a picture book about a child that lives with dyslexia. Just My Luck up here in the right-hand corner, story about autism. Chapter book, Fish in a Tree. Chapter book, story about dyslexia. And The Pirate of Kindergarten is a picture book about living with a visual impairment. These are just a few. There's tons and tons out there. You could also get them in audiobooks. And if you start Googling some of these on Amazon, you'll start finding a lot more of related titles. So again, thinking about how fiction, thinking about how videos, thinking about how TV and mainstream media can really help and shape and promote greater inclusive societies. Now, lastly, social media influence. I wanted to share a few. I'm not endorsing any of these. I don't work for any of these people. And there's a ton out there. And again, in the chat, feel free to pop your thoughts in there. One of the things that I'm noticing a big trend is happening on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter is parents of kids with various disabilities being vulnerable and sharing their experience through social media. And it can be a great way for parents to gain support, gain resources, build relationships, but it's also a way that I think it's starting to normalize disability. So Finding Cooper's Voice, I don't know if anyone follows that one. That's on, I follow it on Facebook. It's a family sharing their life story with their son Cooper, who lives with autism. Special Books by Special Kids is a series of short videos of a former special educator who travels around the country and interviews individuals with various disabilities, or really getting to know them as people. One I recently found was this one, Rosalie Masteler, whose son is an amputee. And she posts a lot of videos and life experience about his experience as an amputee and having a son as an amputee. So I'm just looking to see, seems like people are pretty familiar with Finding Cooper's Voice. It's a very popular one. But there's lots and lots out there. And again, one of the ways that I think we can help create more inclusive societies is to demonstrate that inclusion is not something that should be outside the norm. Disability is not something that should be outside the norm. So the more that we can engage, and I think use social media as a platform to elevate the disability voice, to amplify the need for greater inclusion, that's a way that we can really start to build and promote more inclusive communities. So again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. So what I'd like to do is take a few moments here to do a quick reflection on this idea of using disability as a way to foster more inclusive societies. Because my guess is that when you hopped on this webinar, you didn't think I was going to make that connection. So in a moment in the chat, you're going to see a link to a Google form. What we're going to do is ask that you click on the link. And when you open up the form, there's going to be 2 questions, and they're both here on the screen. So one question is, how can disability representation in mainstream media influence greater inclusion of people with disabilities? I've shared my thoughts to that question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts from your experience. And then also, what do you see as a benefit for your children and or students to be exposed to disability representation in the media, whether you're talking about students with or without disabilities? We might have access to some music to put on, but we are going to give you about 2 minutes to fill out that form. If you need any assistance, pop in the chat and we'll help you. Right. So I hope everyone was able to take a few moments there to reflect on this idea of how promoting and providing opportunities to share and engage with disability representation in media, whether that's videos, whether that's TV, whether that's social media, whether that's books, is a way that we can really help to, again, normalize disability. It's a way that we can avoid self-pity. It's a way that we can help to promote that empathy and understanding and really that awareness of the value of disability inclusion. So let's jump to another quote here. Let's stop tolerating or accepting difference, as if we're so much better for not being different in the first place. Instead, let's celebrate difference, because in this world, it takes a lot of guts to be different. So just to kind of recap a little bit about what we talked about so far in this afternoon's webinar, we began with that video around how inclusion makes the world more vibrant. From there, we talked about all of the places and spaces in our communities, whether that's a school community, whether that's a town community, whatever that definition of community means to you. We then talked about the difference between access to those spaces, access to content and information, and what it means to feel fully included in those places and spaces. And then most recently, we kind of deconstructed this concept of the roles in which disability representation in media can propel this movement forward. And I shared with you some specific examples of disability in media that I thought would be helpful for you. What I want to do now is really start to unpack some other specific strategies that we can use. So when we think about inclusion in society, again, not just access, but inclusion, there's a few specific things that we can do. So one thing we can do is think about sensory-friendly silent dances. So this is a new trend that's happening where it was designed for students and individuals living on the spectrum who would feel very overwhelmed at any sort of dance. And so sensory-friendly silent dances is this new idea where you wear headphones and you hear the music that way, and you can select what music you're listening to. But the dance itself, the space itself is silent, and everybody is just listening to the music through their headphones. So again, it's taking this idea of access and really starting to move the pendulum to inclusion, right? Everybody is there. Everybody is participating. Everyone feels safe. Everyone is feeling a sense of belonging. Another way to think about this is fully inclusive playgrounds. So again, thinking about those places and spaces and ensuring that our play structures and our parks and our outdoor places are inclusive to everybody. Not just inclusive physically to those with physical challenges, but what are the different places throughout the playground that kids might be able, or adults might be able to migrate to and spend time at if they're feeling a little bit perhaps overwhelmed. Unified sports teams. So I put unified sports teams up here as a different thing than adaptive sports programs, right? Because adaptive sports programs are often just individuals with disabilities participating in athletics together. Unified sports teams are when you have individuals with disabilities and individuals without disabilities participating in an athletic activity together. So that is inclusion. When we think about students in school, because I know we have some educators on this call this afternoon, we can engage individuals with disabilities in decision-making in their lives, right? So if we can empower individuals with disabilities to have a voice, have some choice, in kind of how the places and spaces work or don't work for them, that's a way that we can create more inclusive societies. And I put IEP meetings, etc., up here on the slide because I think engaging students in IEP meetings starting in elementary school is a way that we start to make that happen. It's a way that we start to help them understand that they are not a problem, but they're actually a solution, right? We want to hear their voice. We want to hear their perspective. We want to tap in to their experience. Lastly, is there's a growing trend right now on creating inclusive workplaces. And there's a lot of companies that are putting a huge emphasis right now on hiring individuals with disabilities. And that studies are showing that hiring individuals with disabilities increases the profitability of a company, which most for-profits are very concerned about, as well as increasing, customer relations, increasing sense of morale, sense of community and belonging. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you a few minutes, about 4 minutes this time. And in a moment in the chat, we're going to drop some links to examples of some other organizations that are doing some of these things that I mentioned. Because I know I just kind of explained it to you, but I want to give you a moment to kind of see it in action. So we'll put some music on for about 3 minutes and give folks really an opportunity to think more about these. And I recognize that not all of these are going to work for you. But what I hope in sharing some of these examples is that it might spark an idea of something that you could do, or spark an idea of something you could help collaborate or co-create to help folks think about creating inclusive places and spaces, both in schools and beyond.
Without the ones like you, who work tirelessly to keep things running, everything would suddenly stop. Hospitals, factories, schools, and power plants, they all depend on you.
Just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone. Suzanne, the plans they made put an end to you. I walked out this morning and I wrote down this song. I just can't remember who to send it to. I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end. I've seen lonely times when I could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again. Don't you look down upon me, Jesus. You gotta help me make a stand. You just got to see me through another day. My body's aching and my time is at hand. I won't make it any other way. Oh, I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
So I hope that that was a nice couple minutes for you to click through some of these links that Dawn put in the chat. We'll make sure that these links are also in the Padlet as well. So a quote from Christopher Reeve: "A hero is an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles." So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to stop the screen share and we're going to open it up to some Q&A opportunities. So if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that they're answered. Again, just a quick recap of what we talked about to remind folks. So questions about definitions of inclusion, the difference between access versus inclusion, the idea of the places and spaces, the concept of using disability representation in media to inspire more inclusive societies. And lastly, we left off with some of those specific strategies or ideas that you could use in your community, or one of those ideas might spark another community or another idea. And I would also encourage you, if you don't have a question in the chat, jot down what sparked for you. Is there something you could bring back to your community as an educator? Is there something that sparked for you that you could do with your child with a disability to support a greater emphasis on inclusive societies? So I'm just gonna go in here and see if we have any questions or thoughts.
Sam, we do have a question to get us started.
Great, thanks, Janelle.
So as a parent or caretaker, how can I advocate for my child at an IEP meeting without upsetting the IEP team or the teacher?
That's a really good question. And I think sometimes what happens is there ends up being this us versus them sort of mentality of the parents are on one side of the table and the administrator and special educators on the other side of the table. I think, you know, it's one of the reasons why I encourage students to be present at IEP meetings is I feel like adults always behave better when kids are around. That's kind of like universal. So having the child there, the student there, is a great way to start building those bridges and reminding folks, you know, that we're all there for a common goal and working together. I think always starting with, oh, that's a great idea, Emily, in the chat, bringing someone else who knows the family. Maybe that's a babysitter, a mentor, an aunt, an uncle, a really good family friend having someone like that can be really beneficial. So start with that. That's one strategy. Another strategy is I always suggest starting an IEP meeting with an opportunity for everybody to go around the table and share their goals for the student, right? Whether that goal is short-term or long-term, but just like giving people the opportunity to share. Because I think what we find is at the end of the day, no matter what the specific goal is, they fit into the same category of life success, of being an advocate, of being independent. And so starting there, I think, is a way to bring people together and be cohesive. Now, it's inevitable that there's going to be some perhaps disagreement in what the school says they're willing to do, could provide, thinks what's best for the student, and what the family is going to believe or want and advocate for. But I think, engaging more people at the table than just parents and school personnel, like a family, a friend, the student themselves, and really thinking about those overarching goals can be really a good place to start.
Great suggestions. And I love the idea of having children there as young as possible, as early as possible. So not only can they be a part of the conversation, but also learn those self-advocacy skills and start to talk to the IEP team about their needs and really be able to impact the team from a different lens, giving the child a voice.
Yeah, and I think, on the next session that we're doing next week here, we're going to talk more about kind of helping students with disabilities build self-advocacy skills. And we'll give a lot of suggestions beyond just building, beyond just having them in an IEP meeting. But I do think having them there at a young age is a really good starting point, because oftentimes we wait to like high school. And at that point, they're already, in a different place. So helping them develop the skills to advocate, and also inclusion, a sense of belonging, a sense of voice, a sense of choice. That's hugely impactful.
Absolutely. Another great question from Evelyn. How can we be better advocates for inclusion without having to hire an advocate and attorney for IEP meetings? This is due to IEP disagreements with placement in general education classrooms when families push for general education, but the IEP team is pushing for a segregated or a special day class placement.
So Evelyn, I don't know if you were on some of our previous webinars here. I think you have been. Your name looks familiar. And I think I'm going to go back to mindset, right? It's that model I've shared again and again, right? What we're trying to do is change behavior, whether that's adult behavior or student behavior, right? So we might be trying to change adult behavior because we want them to better include a student with a disability. But in order to do that, we need to change their perceptions, stereotypes, bias about disability. And in order to do that, we need to provide them with some foundational knowledge or understanding about that disability. So I really think it could be simple things like sharing some of those video links, right? Like recommending that members of an IEP team watch CODA, maybe if it's a child with a hearing loss. Members of the IEP team watch Atypical, right? Members of the IEP team following some of the social media accounts. I think oftentimes folks are resistant to change, which I think is what your question is getting at, right? And oftentimes we hire attorneys or consultants or advocates, right? I know I do that as part of my work, right? They hire them to go in and force change a little faster. And what I find is it's that the school personnel are afraid of change. They don't understand, they don't even know where to begin. They don't know what the repercussions are going to be. And so I think the more that we can use opportunities like disability representation in media to build greater awareness, understanding, and hopefully comfort on the topic, that then we can come in and work more collaboratively on these things rather than an us versus them, right? Like ultimately what we want is we want the school teams to go to parents and say, we want to include your child in gen ed. What do you think would work best? Let's work together and make that happen.
And another great comment by Jennifer here, just really going back to collaborating as a team with parents and families, is making sure that we're asking parents first if the child can be included, and working with the family to include the child in the IEP meeting and other conversations at an appropriate time.
Definitely. I think part of it is really about proactive planning. I think, and I recognize I was a teacher, public school, totally get it. It's busy, it's crazy, there's crises, there's limited time, there's a lot to cover, right? It gets really busy. But I think oftentimes what happens is in schools, it's just so busy that it's like, oh my God, we have an IEP meeting this afternoon. And it's like, people rush to like send out the invite or, print out the paperwork, and then they get there and it's like, all right, we're just going to cross our T's and dot our I's, right? So it's really about ongoing engagement. So I think one of the biggest things that parents can do to advocate and work collaboratively as well is be proactive. So don't wait for the day of for that case manager to get you the information. Be emailing that case manager 2 weeks ahead of time, a week ahead of time, but saying, hey, I see I have a meeting on my calendar. Can you follow up and remind me, where we're meeting, what time, all of that? Is it possible to talk with you ahead of time, prior to the meeting? There's no reason why we have to wait for a designated IEP meeting to talk about our kids. With the digital world now, with folks' comfort level on Zoom, there's no reason why you can't have a meeting with multiple people prior to another meeting, just to check in, discuss, check the pulse. And I think school personnel are really, really busy. So I don't think it's with malintent that they don't reach out, but they're just busy. So I think parents, caregivers, guardians need to sometimes reach out and say, hey, could we do a month? Could we do a weekly check-in for 5 minutes on the phone? Could we do a monthly check-in, something like that?
Sure. So another question that's coming in. Sam, you provided us with great ideas for literature and television shows and movies that show representation of disability. The question is, how do I know if what I see in the media is a good or authentic representation of disability and not just a bad stereotype?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's no one answer. One resource that I didn't put in, but we'll add it to the Padlet, is the Ruderman Foundation out of Boston. They are very well known in, and I don't know if anyone here knows Ruderman, but Ruderman Foundation is really big on disability representation in the media. They put a lot of their funds into advocacy. So I would say anything that they recommend is going to be pretty reputable. I also always caution folks that, one of the reasons why I shared the resources that I shared is that in each of those videos and or TV shows, the character with the disability actually has a disability in real life. And that might seem like, well, why wouldn't they cast disabled, individuals with disabilities in these roles? But traditionally, Hollywood hasn't. And so I think, it's going to be more authentic if we can ensure that the actor playing the character with a disability does live with that disability. And then I think we also have to just, use our own kind of common sense and watch all of these with a little bit of a grain of salt. I would always suggest pre-watching anything before you decide to show it to your kids, show it to your students, or share it widely.
Yeah, so really lifting up the voices of individuals with disabilities. Sam, I'd love to do a shameless plug right now, because in the chat earlier today, folks were talking about the show Crip Camp on Netflix. And one of the key individuals with disabilities featured in the show, Judy Human, is going to be one of our keynote presenters at our inclusion conference, which also Sam will be presenting at on May 4th and May 5th. So we'll make sure to put the registration in the chat right now for folks. Also, another show that was talked about in the chat is Born This Way, and Megan Baumgars, who is featured on the show Born This Way, will be a keynote presenter at our inclusion conference. So shameless plug there.
And
Another,
people can register for that now, right?
correct. Yep. So we'll put that in the chat in just a second.
Oh, Iris, yes, we hope to see you there.
So here we go. Just gonna throw it in right now.
So in, because that's what inclusion is. We're all in. Place where everybody's in, is participating, has a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So another question, we have so many great questions coming in. So just a few minutes to address them. At what age do you think it's appropriate to have kids start attending their IEP meetings? Going back to that question of
Good question.
self-advocacy.
I don't know if it's a particular age as much as developmental level. So first of all, I think kids need to be aware of their own disability before they attend. So if you, as a parent, you don't feel comfortable talking to your kid about their disability, I don't think they're in a place, and I think it would make others feel uncomfortable to have that student there. So making sure your child already knows and has that self-awareness about their disability. And again, next week, we'll be talking more about how we go about doing that. I think making sure that the child is able to communicate, again, not necessarily through voice, that could be through ASL, that could be through an AAC device, but they need to be able to articulate their experiences. They need to be able to articulate what they feel they're good at, their strengths, and they need to be able to articulate what their needs might be. So I think all of those things are things that have to be put into consideration when we consider when it's appropriate. I would say, second, third grade is probably a pretty safe time that most likely students are going to have meet all those criteria. Not to say, however, that a younger student who meets those criteria couldn't participate. But again, I would kind of think about that as the mental checklist of, do they know about their disability? Because in an IP meeting, you're going to throw out labels, right? You're going to talk about things. So you've got to know what your label is, what your disability is. You need to have some self-awareness of your strengths and needs. You need to be able to communicate in that way as well.
Sure. So another question about instructional practices. My son's teacher keeps making accommodations for him that he doesn't really need. How do I get her to back off and let him struggle a little bit? So a little bit of that productive struggle, and so that he can learn in his own way.
So I would argue, and this goes back to, I think, the first webinar we did, 4 or 5 ago, I would argue that the teacher most likely has more of a sympathetic perspective on your son than an empathetic perspective on your son. And we know that when we're sympathetic, we feel bad for somebody. We feel like, oh, they must feel like they can't achieve this. They're not keeping up with others at the same rate. So as the adult, I'm going to maybe differentiate things a little bit too much to make this child seem more in line with the rest of the peers, right? So I think the best way to deal with this is to, again, it goes back to mindset, is that we've got to help this teacher have a more empathetic perspective on your son, better understand his experience, recognize that empathy, if you let someone struggle, if you let someone get frustrated a little bit, you're still being empathetic, right? And you can help that child from an empathetic lens rather than a sympathetic lens work through that struggle and actually come out the other side and feel a greater sense of accomplishment. It's like the video I showed on Tuesday night, I think, if anyone was here, about the little girl talking about her one-on-one aide next to her, like doing her work for her. So that's what I would challenge you to think about is, and again, Don will throw my email in the chat a couple more times. I'm happy to talk with anybody off this webinar and give more specific individual support. But I think it's probably a difference between shifting that teacher's perspective from sympathetic towards your son's challenges to empathetic.
Yeah, I'm really focusing on that, presuming competence for all children. It's okay to struggle a little bit. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. Another excellent question. My daughter has ADHD She was diagnosed at the end of high school, but she gets really upset when trying to talk to the college about her accommodations and needs. So she's very good with language, but number sense is challenging for her. What might be a good solution?
Yeah, so on next week, I'm going to talk a lot more about this. But what I talk about is that what we're trying to do with your daughter is help her gain self-advocacy skills. She is not going to be a self-advocate for herself if she doesn't first feel self-confident in herself and her ADHD. And she's not going to feel self-confident in herself and her ADHD if she doesn't first fully understand it. And, I don't know you, I don't know your daughter, but one thought is since she wasn't diagnosed till end of high school, maybe she doesn't fully understand her ADHD. Or maybe she doesn't have that self-confidence. Maybe she feels ashamed about having ADHD or something like that. So maybe it would be interesting to explore with her some, very successful people in the world who have ADHD. Maybe there's a support group in her community or a learning center at her school where she could go and meet and talk with other kids, or an online group. Maybe she'd feel more comfortable chatting or joining a Facebook group and interacting and connecting with other folks her age who live with ADHD. But I think in order for her to be a self-advocate, it has to come from her, and she's got to be confident in herself first and foremost. It sounds like since she's good with language, it's not, I wouldn't suggest a script or anything. It sounds like she already understands that. Maybe emailing her professor would be less scary for her or less intimidating than talking face to face too.
Mm-hmm. Great suggestions. Another question.
And it looks like Teresa in the chat might have a great social media influencer to help with this too.
Oh, great. She's looking for the name now. Excellent. ADHD can be a superpower once you face it. Love it. Sam, another question as we're looking for our social media influencer. My daughter's one-on-one aide keeps telling her that she is just like everyone else, but I want her to be proud of her disabled identity. How do I reconcile this?
Yeah, so that can be, again, and it's that's more of that medical model of disability, right? The medical model of we're just trying to make all these kids fit in like everybody else. We're trying to change them to be like everybody else, rather than the social model of disability. And I talked about this in the very first webinar, the social model of disability around creating inclusive spaces that are designed for diverse learners. I think that this would be an opportunity to help the para. I'm going to go back to the illustration I've used before of the identity puzzle. And so helping this para understand that your child has an identity puzzle. And this identity puzzle is made up of pieces that make up who they are, and that their disability and difference is a piece of who they are. And that piece is never going to go away. There may be times in your child's life where they see that piece as bigger, and there may be times where they wish or they see that piece as smaller. But that really helping this para-educator recognize, and maybe this is something that could happen collaboratively in an IEP meeting if the para can attend, but maybe that sort of conversation can happen there.
Great suggestion. It looks like there's Teresa included a link to some great videos on Facebook that can be used to get a better sense of the young lady who she watches on Facebook and talks about her diagnosis. And those are all the questions that we have today, Sam.
Well, those were great questions. Dawn put my email in the chat just a few minutes ago. We'll make sure that the link, let me actually pull up my slide deck one more time, because we do have one more slide here now that we've had some time for Q&A. So February 3rd is today. That isn't supposed to be the 3rd. That is supposed to be February 8th, isn't it, Janelle?
It is.
So just imagine that there's 2 little lines there. So on February 8th from 3:30 to 5, we're going to have our next session. It will be simultaneously translated into Spanish as well. And next session, we're going to talk about how, educators, it's going to be geared a little more towards parents, but everybody is invited because we are inclusive here at the Supporting Inclusive Practices and Changing Perspectives webinars, how we can use this concept of disability awareness, talking to your kids about their disability, talking to your students about their disability, can be used to leverage self-confidence, and then from self-confidence, be displayed in greater advocacy skills to really help individuals with disabilities live independent, successful lives.
Can't wait, Sam. February 8th, that's Tuesday, same time, same place, same Zoom link. For those of you who registered, you're automatically registered for both sessions, and registration is still open. So if you want to share widely on social media how amazing tonight's session was, you are welcome to do that and encourage your colleagues, your friends, your family to also join next Tuesday. And
yeah,
okay.
I would say, sorry to interject there, Janelle, but I would say, parents of kids with disabilities, this is also an opportunity to engage grandparents, uncles, aunts. It's an opportunity to help all members of your extended family better understand your child with a disability.
I'm going to drop the link for registration in the chat right now for folks who might want to share with others. But they would just go to our events page on our website, and I'm going to drop that direct link here so that folks can register for Tuesday. And then also once they register, they also receive today's recording on the Padlet. So even though they weren't here today, they can get caught up on today's recording. There you go. All right, folks, if there aren't any other questions, we'll be on for just a few more minutes if anyone has any last minute questions, but we look forward to seeing you Tuesday. We look forward to seeing you at our inclusion conference, and thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. You're welcome, Evelyn. You're welcome,